We've all experienced those moments when life throws you a curveball. Maybe you've had an unexpected medical expense or got into a fender bender. The worst part is not having the money to pay for it right away. That's where the banking app Dave comes in. It's like having a financial safety net that can get you out of those tight spots when you really need it. With Dave, you could get up to $500 instantly with their extra cash feature. Yes, you heard that right. Up to $500 without any interest, late fees, or credit checks. Imagine having that extra cushion to fill your tank, finally get your car repaired, or catch up on bills without having to wait for your next paycheck. It's a game changer. Now I know what you're thinking. Is Dave just another app that promises the world but falls short? Well, let me tell you, millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app and have experienced the financial relief they desperately needed. Dave is the real deal. So, if you're tired of living paycheck to paycheck and need some extra help, don't wait any longer. Download Dave today and think of it as a helping hand from future you. To get started, simply go to dave.com/letsread. That's dave.com/letsread. And sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, be sure to visit dave.com/legal. Please note that instant transfer fees apply. Dave's banking services are provided by Evolve, member FDIC. I've been into hiking and camping for as long as I can remember. I was an Eagle Scout, then after that I managed to convince a few high school and then college friends to come along on a few trips with me. My passion for the outdoors stayed strong long after graduation, but as all of my old hiking buddies started dropping out of the hobby, it got harder and harder to put a trip together. In the end, it seemed like if I wanted to go hiking as regularly as I wanted to, I was going to have to start going solo. Solo hiking seemed kind of lame at first. I mean, what good are all these experiences if you can't share them with someone? Hardship and struggle forge very strong bonds between people, and that was half the joy of it. Each trip would bring another set of adventures and memories. I'm talking real experiences too, not just getting drunk and sharing funny vines with each other. But as it turns out, solo hiking is actually pretty fun. Suddenly I wasn't constrained by what anybody else wanted to do, where they wanted to go, or when a trip could take place. I could just think it up and do it. Clock out of work on a Friday afternoon and then spend the whole weekend in the woods before being back in bed on Sunday night. Don't mind if I do. Take off for a whole week to hike a section of the Great Appalachian? Why not? The only real issue with going solo is safety. I grew to envy my European counterparts, especially those in the United Kingdom. They can head out alone with nothing but a fully charged phone, a spot of tea, and a few crumpets, you know? Whereas here in the United States, you need bear mace, a GPS system, sometimes a gun if you want to feel really safe and secure. I'm not saying I was terrified every time I went anywhere, but you hear enough stories to know it's better to be caught packing than caught lacking. I only brought a gun with me once I was up in the Sierras, and that was for the bears and big cats, but much like anywhere else a person might go, it's not really the wildlife that you need to be afraid of. It's the people. Like I mentioned, you hear some really crazy stories, and I heard a lot of them, right up until I stumbled into my very own cautionary tale, one that started with me meeting a girl. So, this one weekend, I decided to take a trip over to Hammersley Wild area, which is like a designated wilderness spot sandwiched between Elk and Susquehannock State Parks. As the name suggests, it's one of the wilder, more secluded areas of natural beauty in the state of Pennsylvania. You gotta drive out to this little place called Crossed Forks, and then turn down a little side road until the blacktop ends and the trail begins. There's one or two small houses out there, but they don't mind you parking there so long as you don't leave a mess. And the place is so off the beaten path that there's hardly anyone else there to worry about messing with your ride. But then I rolled up late Friday afternoon and there's another car there, with a girl leaning up against it. She's cute, dressed in hiking gear, but she looks angry. Not exactly furious or anything, but super annoyed at something. I parked a distance from her, not wanting to crowd her or draw any anger or anything like that, and then got out and started pulling my gear out of my trunk. I didn't want to be a creep and start any unwanted conversation or anything, so I just resigned myself to walking past her and minding my own business. But as I started on my walk, we made a little awkward eye contact and we kinda fell into conversation. We swapped haze, and I asked her if she was okay, and she replied no. And well, that was that. It turns out that she had a friend stand her up for a hike that she'd been really looking forward to, and wasn't looking forward to driving all the way back home with nothing to show for it. She was debating going up the trail alone, but also wanted to see if she could convince her friend to come out anyways, as she was well aware that hiking alone as a female was not the brightest of ideas. I told myself it was the polite thing to do, but I also knew that inviting her to hike with me was a great way of getting to know a very pretty girl that clearly shared a passion for the outdoors. So I did just that, and asked her if she wanted to come join me. There was this definite moment of hesitation from her. She didn't look like the kind of girl to just go walking down some remote forest trail with a complete stranger, and for a second there, I figured that she was going to politely decline me. But then there was this sort of flash of spontaneity in her eye, before she looks at me with a big smile and said, "Sure." She told me her name was Allie, and as we walked, I explained that I was planning on making camp somewhere to stay for the weekend, but that I'd be happy to walk her back to her car once she was ready to leave. She thanked me, said that I was sweet for offering, and then carried on breaking the ice and swapping small talk. Then, once we got more comfortable with one another, I can safely say that it made for one of the best first dates that I'd ever been on. It definitely had this kind of vibe to it. I'm no Disney prince or anything like that, but I'm not terrible to look at, and I know when a girl is flirting with me and not just being polite or nice or whatever. So as we walked and talked, I started getting pretty excited about where this might lead. It had been a while since I tried any dating, and my brief kind of jump into Tinder had been a total disaster. I always found it was much more appealing to meet a person naturally, rather than to use the internet to sort of force it. But as I'm sure many of you will agree, that's much easier said than done. Given how it was a mutual interest, we talked a lot about hiking at first, places we'd been, close calls that we've had, and stuff like that. But as time went on, we started talking about other things too, like our jobs, our families, and relationships. She told me that she'd been single for a while, but she wasn't looking for anything at that moment. But she was also quick to add that if the right thing came along, that she'd been open to changing her mind about the whole not looking thing. It seemed like a loaded statement, but it was a very welcome one, and as we continued to walk, I wondered if that chance meeting with her was the start of some lifelong romance. Now looking back on it, I actually cringe at how naive that sounds, but I guess loneliness is a hell of a thing. Maybe about an hour into our hike, we were walking along the edge of the stream when Allie stopped to take a picture. She then asked me to give her a second while she texted her friend, saying that she didn't have enough signal for a call, but could probably force a text through. To me, it was a very familiar little dance. Hammersley is pretty close to a town, but thanks to all the hills surrounding us, cell signal was kind of hard to come by. While she was texting, I wandered back stream a little bit, just waiting for Allie to finish up doing her thing, when something caught my eye maybe 50 or 60 yards downstream. A flash of movement in the trees, only very slightly, but I 100% saw something for sure. I walked back to Allie to ask if she had any bear spray or anything on her, but when she said yes, I wasn't completely reassured. It was nice that we'd both be able to defend ourselves in the event of an animal attack, but at the same time, I didn't want anything to ruin our hike, especially if that thing happened to be bear-shaped. I told her I thought that I might have spotted something downstream. She said that she'd keep her eyes peeled, and then we went off on our way as usual. Maybe an hour later, half-hour later, we came out of the trees and onto a wide-open meadow that sloped slightly upwards. When we got to the top, or rather where the gentle slope turned into a steep hill, we stopped and turned around to take in the view. Nothing had followed us out into the meadow, so I figured that we were okay on the wild animal front. But just to be safe, I decided to pull out this little monocular, or spyglass for you pirate fans, that I was carrying with me to check out the tree line below us. I scan, and I don't see anything, but then I scan it a second time, and I see a dark figure moving parallel to the tree line. I can't really make out any details because of the difference in the light, but there was definitely something there. And right when I thought that they might just be some fellow innocent hiker that I was making the object of my own paranoia, the figure stopped, turned their profile, and just stayed still. At first, I thought they might have been taking a leak or something, but then it hit me. They were watching us. I immediately directed Allie's attention to the figure, pointing out where I'd been looking before handing her the spyglass. She put it to her eye, listened again as I gave her directions where to look, but then gave me some skeptical reply when I asked her if she could see anything. She asked me if I was 100% sure that the person had been watching us, and to be fair, I didn't know for certain. I just had a bad feeling based off the previous little flash of movement in the trees back near the stream. I tried again to get her to look in the right spot, then politely took the spyglass back from her to look for myself. And when I did, I saw that there was no one there. Or at least there was no one in the spot that I had been originally looking. I scanned the tree line for a third time in almost as many minutes, and that time there was nothing there, but I still felt very uneasy and suggested that we just move on. Our original plan had been to hike around the base of the hill that we come to, then head back down the same trail to where Allie's car was parked. But because of how uneasy I felt, I suggested that we walk a longer route so it wouldn't have to double back on ourselves. I could see that Allie was starting to get a little suspicious of my intentions. There she was, having to agree to go on a short hike with some stranger, probably out of sheer politeness, and there I was, trying to talk her into further going into the wilderness with talk of some shadowy pursuers. She seemed skeptical, but she agreed, most likely knowing that she could turn the bear mace on me if I started to get a little fresh, which I wasn't. After walking another mile or so, the tension had started to clear up, though. No one was following us anymore, at least they didn't appear to be, and I was starting to think that I was just being overly paranoid, like it was the nerves of trying to shoot my shot bleeding over into something else, you know? And speaking of which, that's pretty much all I was focused on from there on out. Allie kept reassuring me, making light-hearted comments about me being desperate for an excuse to save her, so I found myself getting more and more chill and forgetting what I assumed was just a coincidence. Not long after walking back into the forest, we hit what I like to call the Babbling Brook. I first heard that term in a Bob Ross video that I saw on YouTube, and this place is one of the larger streams looking like something the man himself would have painted. People sometimes give Pennsylvania a hard time given how industrialized parts of it are, but there's plenty of natural beauty to be had here, and in sharing it with my potential date, I was hoping to up my chances a little. Allie seemed delighted with it and started snapping pictures while I paced around with a smug smile on my face. She liked the place so much, she wanted to hang out there for a while to take a breather and eat some snacks, and while we did, she was planning on texting her friend the pictures, signal permitting, to show her what she was missing out on. While Allie was keeping busy trying to text, I excused myself to just go take a leak somewhere private, and then headed off into the trees to find somewhere secluded. I find a spot, do my thing, then, just as I'm turning around to head back, I hear something in the trees behind me. I'm instantly reminded of that sensation of being followed, only this time, I actually make an effort to find out if there's anything or anyone that was trailing us. I started walking directly towards where I'd heard the noise, calling out and asking if there was anyone there, and that's when I see him. This big guy, wearing hiking gear, and was walking away from me at a pace. I found the hiking gear kind of reassuring in a way, like I could give him the benefit of the doubt, but at the same time, I was now confronted with evidence that we were being followed. Hammersley is a big place, and sure, it gets kind of busy on a weekend, but not on a Friday afternoon, which is half the reason I like to get a head start by arriving at that very time. The chances of just running into someone, especially off the trails, is slim to none, so as much as I wasn't straight up convinced that we were being followed, I still wanted to confront that guy to at least make sure. I called out to him, not in some overly aggressive way, just to get his attention, you know. I planned on asking him something fairly innocent like, "You okay?" or something like that, just to gauge his mood, but when he turned, I was stunned into silence. He was dressed like a hiker, all right, but he had these thick, heavy-looking gloves on, almost like those riot gloves that you see with the hard knuckles, and the lower half of his face was covered with a hunting gaiter, the kind where only the person's eyes are showing. Well, a face covering like that was totally normal during 2020 and 2021, and still kind of accepted today. You see, back in 2015, it was definitely not a regular thing to see, especially since the guy didn't have any kind of orange indicators on his clothing for hunting, or more importantly, no weapon that I could see. I was sort of relieved to see no weapon in his hands, but the fact that he was covering his face meant that he was obviously up to no good. And then there was the fact that he just refused to respond to me when I finally did ask him if everything was okay. He just gave me this sort of death stare for a second, and then turned again and walked off into the woods. Now my mind is rushing like a mile a minute by this point. Following us down a single trail was one thing, but this dude had potentially tracked us across an open meadow, and then it just so happened to stay on our trail even though we traversed the hill and picked up a seemingly random route. I'd like to think of myself as kind of an outdoorsman, but to me, those were some freakily accurate tracking skills. And if this guy was using his powers for evil, then that was going to be a big problem for us. I rushed back to Allie, told her exactly what I'd seen, and told her that we needed to move fast. I told her that I knew it sounded crazy, and that I totally understood why she'd think that I was a creep or whatever, but I'd rather she think that I was a creep and live than not act on anything and risk both of our lives. So much horrifying stuff seems to happen because people don't stop and just tell themselves, this isn't normal or safe, and I need to leave. And I was having one of those moments right there. I gave my little speech at Tommy gun speed, and I honestly thought that I'd convinced her for a second. But when I was done, and I started walking off while beckoning her to follow me, she just stayed put. I remember saying, "We need to leave, Allie, now." But instead of following me, she gave me a mouthful. She told me I was acting like a total jerk, and that if we were being followed, she'd have known something about it. She wasn't some defenseless little girl either, so she resented me acting like it, and according to her, just because someone happened to be on our trail didn't mean they were acting maliciously. They were all good points, and on any other occasion I might have echoed them back to her, but I knew this was not any other occasion. Something was quite obviously shady with this weirdo, and we needed to exercise the proper caution, stat. And it was about then that I started to notice this sort of gradual change in the way Allie was talking to me. It went from something like, "Come on, dude, you're being ridiculous," and urging me to stay, to accusing me of being a mixture of dumb, cowardly, and mentally ill. I wanted to walk her back to her car. She wanted to stay put and not even move on to someplace else downstream. And if I wanted to move or leave her, then I wasn't half the man I thought I was, among other personal attacks from her. I just remember being confused beyond belief. It honestly felt like a weird dream. It seemed like any girl in their right mind would at least be kind of alarmed at the prospect of being followed by a man wearing a mask. But here was Allie, not even in the least bit bothered by the sight of me being visibly shaken up as I warned her of the potential danger. The only mitigating factor, I guess, was this idea that she thought it was me who was trying to trick her into, I don't know, going someplace more remote so I could go all Ted Bundy on her without being discovered. That I totally understood, and I suspected that her reluctance was coming from there, and not being dumb or naive or untrusting enough to not respond to my warnings. We were both being pretty loud by that point, arguing back and forth, and it hit me that our volume would make it very easy for someone to both zero in on us and catch us unaware. I remember looking around just to make sure that we were still alone, and I felt that creeping, skin-crawling feeling that comes with knowing that you're actually being watched. I honestly thought that if I just started to walk off, that Allie would come to her senses somehow and follow. So, that's what I did. I started walking off, looking back just once to see if she was going to follow or not. She looked furious, though. I mean, really angry. And it was obviously because she wasn't going to get her way. But there was something else to it, too. She wasn't going to get her way, but what she intended wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing that she could carry on doing without me. It was something that she put a lot of time and effort and excitement into, something that was so close to coming together but was falling apart at the last minute. I guess with the gift of hindsight, some of you have figured out by now, but in that moment, what was actually going on was almost completely inconceivable to me. Almost, but not quite. I realized that two of the big questions in front of me had answers that were intrinsically linked. The reason why the guy in the hunting gear could find us so easy was interwoven with the reason Allie wanted to stay in that exact spot near the babbling brook. The masked stranger and my new hiking companion were working together. Now, I know I couldn't have known that for certain in that moment, and I'm not sure I could even describe how quick and how panicked my thought process was in that moment, but again, it was a case of get the hell out of there, be wrong, but live, or I could not trust my gut and potentially run into something I wouldn't walk away from. And being the kind of person I am, I chose the path of least resistance. I started walking off, still in disbelief of how surreal it all was. It was a real, this cannot be happening right now kind of moment, like I couldn't believe how things had started off so well but gone so horribly wrong in just an hour or two. But I could at least still see the funny side, or kind of funny side. Maybe I was being a total jerk, and I was going to look back at that hike as being the time that I blew my shot over some weird attack of paranoia. Unfortunately, the funny side was only visible for a matter of seconds, as after that, any benefit of the doubt was blown away by an ear-splitting screech that came following me through the trees. You gotta understand, too, that hearing these three little words probably made for the single most terrifying moment in my entire life. All I heard after a few seconds of silence was Allie screaming out, "He's getting away." The second that I heard that, I just instinctively ran. I don't know if it was finding out all that so-called paranoia had been justified, but I mean it when I say that. When it all came together like that, I could feel my heart pounding out of my chest. I had no idea where the guy was, if he was close or what he had in his pack, so I popped the clasp on my pack and wiggled it off my back and then moved my legs faster than I'd ever moved them before, and I didn't stop until I felt like puking. I always wore like a kind of fishing jacket, the kind with a lot of pockets, and I kept all my absolute essentials in there, car keys included. If they'd have been in my pack, I'd have been forced to run with it, and if that was the case, I honestly don't know if I'd be around to write this. After I stopped for maybe a minute to catch my breath, I kept pushing through the trees back towards my truck, trying not to trip and fall on my face as I kept checking over my shoulder. I knew the guy wasn't some master tracker anymore. He'd obviously been coordinating with that so-called Allie, if that even was her real name, but I still had that fear that I was going to look over my shoulder and he'd just be there. Thankfully, he wasn't, and I made it back to my truck, jumped in, and drove off. I kept telling myself that I'd call the cops the moment that I walked through the door, but when it came time to doing it, I found that it might have been a bad idea. I don't think any kind of crime had actually been committed, in which case, what exactly was I going to report? I hadn't even tried to retrieve my bag or anything, and if it was gone, the least I could report was it stolen or something. So that's what I decided to do. I waited a day to try and ensure no one was using it for bait or whatever, and then went out to retrieve it, and I found it untouched. I'd actually found myself hoping that someone had, I don't know, maybe gone through it or tried to damage it in some way, as that might yield some DNA or maybe fingerprints, I guess. But no, my pack was just there, exactly where I dropped it, totally untouched. I had nothing to show for my experience, only my word and my memories. But as any attorney will tell you, those are about as useful to the cops as a chocolate coffee pot. There was nothing I could do. I had no recourse, nothing that wouldn't put my own safety at risk anyways. But then I realized that there was something I could do, even if it was just some insignificant internet post or email that gets ignored, downvoted, or buried, or whatever. Because if just one person reads this, who was thinking of hiking through Hammersley, and actually listens and takes note, then I might just save a life. Because if I'm right, and I wasn't just being completely and utterly paranoid, There's a couple out there who are setting traps for unwary male hikers, and I only avoided falling into it by the skin of my teeth. Almost 10 years ago now, my wife and I decided to go on a little hiking trip in southern Massachusetts, specifically the Miles Standish State Forest. We checked out a few options for cabin rental and found one that was within our budget, and then booked it for a weekend. It was a beautiful little place, not far from a heart-shaped pond with ready access to all the different hiking trails dotted around the park. Our first day was wonderful. We had a picnic over near College Pond, followed by a basic campfire-style dinner back at our cabin. The daytime was beautiful, but the nighttime was intimidating to say the least. There were plenty of little campgrounds and cabins dotting all over the forest, so it wasn't like we were in a particularly secluded place. But nighttime in the city is very different to nighttime in the woods, especially if you grew up and spent most of your life in the former. There's something very eerie about it, so much so that both me and my wife commented on it independently of one another. We weren't scared at all. We felt very safe out there, so the feeling was something of a novelty, I guess, and not something that robbed us of any sleep. The second day was similar to the first. We did some hiking, had another al fresco lunch, and then returned to the cabin in time for dinner. But instead of eating at the cabin, we went over to Mirbeau, just south of Plymouth, for a fancy 3-course dinner and a bottle of wine. We discussed taking a taxi to and from the Mirbeau complex, but I decided that I wanted to be fresh for the next morning, so I drove and my wife drank. The wine went down a little too well, though, and by the time we got back to the cabin, she was so wasted that she dozed off the moment her head hit the pillow. I didn't begrudge her the chance to tie one on like that. I thought it was funny. But it turned out to be very fortunate that only one of us drank that night, and I'll tell you why. After my wife passed out and was snoring, very loudly I might add, I brushed my teeth, took a shower, and then climbed into bed. It was just before midnight at that time, and I set an alarm for 7:30 a.m. God knows how long later that I wake up to what I assume is my phone vibrating on the rustic wooden bedside table next to my head. I reached up to grab it, only to realize that it's not my phone making the noise. It's something else entirely. Something is softly scratching the wood at the other side of the cabin wall, almost right next to where I'd been laying my head. Now, while this was very creepy for a second or two, I'm a rational enough person to realize that a sound like that is most probably some kind of animal, and having done my research, I knew all we had to worry about were snakes and possibly foxes or coyotes. There tend not to be any bears or mountain lions in this area of Massachusetts, or rather, the chances of encountering the former at least are extremely remote. It was the reason we'd chosen the state forest in the first place, knowing it was one of the safer options for hiking, so, like I said, hearing the sound was startling but not scary. At first, I tried to go back to sleep, hoping that whatever was making that scratching sound would just get bored and go away. I know a lot of animals scratch their claws or teeth against wood as a way of filing them down or sharpening them, so I thought that it was maybe something small and non-threatening doing exactly that. But then, the scratching started to move, and it sounded like it was coming from another section of wall, much higher up than before. I say much higher up. It was only maybe a foot or two higher, but in my head, whatever was making the sound went from, say, squirrel-sized to fox-sized. Again, this was fairly alarming, and I picked my head up off the pillow again while I wondered if I should do anything. In the end, I climbed out of bed, went over to where I could hear the scratching, and then banged on the wall a few times to try and scare it off. And sure enough, that seemed to do the trick. And the sound of my fist against the wall didn't wake up my wife, so I climbed back into bed without saying a word. I swear I was right on the verge of drifting back off when the scratching sound started up again. I realized that if I wanted to get anything resembling a good night's sleep, I'd have to head outside with my flashlight and really scare this thing off. So I climbed out of bed, put on some clothes, and then headed out into the dark with my light. I could hear whatever it was still scratching against the wood, but I wasn't in the least bit scared, as I figured that I'd just run away the first moment it saw the beam of my flashlight or heard my feet. It did exactly that, and I heard it running off into the darkness just before I turned the corner. But in place of the familiar four-legged cadence of a fox or a coyote, I heard the very distinct sound of something running, with 2 feet, not 4. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. And right hand to God, that realization made for the creepiest moment of my entire life. That whole time I thought everything was just fine, but there'd been some freaking creep scratching something into the wood that whole time, and I'd actually tried to go back to sleep. I darted back into the cabin, grabbed the biggest, heaviest thing I could find, this skillet, and then ran back outside. I wanted to shout something brave and hardcore, but the God's honest truth is I was scared out of my mind. I could barely even keep a straight thought in my head, let alone figure out anything intimidating to yell. So I just ran around, spinning around like a top, shining the flashlight in every little shadow to make sure no one was about to creep up on me. Once I was pretty certain that the coast was actually clear, I ran back into the cabin, locked the front door, and then woke up my wife. She was still half drunk, but she sobered up pretty quickly when I told her to keep her cell phone handy, just in case I needed her to call 911. I still don't know if it was just a dumb prank or something, kids vandalizing the cabins or deliberately trying to scare us or something. It all depended on what they'd been scratching into the wall, that much was clear, but I was in no mood to just wander back out into the dark to go check right away. We just stayed put for a few minutes, my hand tied around the skillet's handle, and listened out for any voices or footsteps or scratching. After a few minutes of silence, I finally crept out into the dark for 2 reasons. Number 1, to make sure that we were truly alone again, and number 2, to check out what the hell this creep had been doing to the cabin's outside wall. I was scared, but I was also ready to cave in the skull of any foolish person enough to rush me. Thankfully, I didn't have to defend myself like that, but there was nothing reassuring about what I'd found scratched into the cabin. When I first saw it, it looked like either a 0 or the letter O, underneath a roughly scratched letter U or V. The result was that it almost looked like someone had tried to write VO, but vertically instead of horizontally. No words immediately came to mind. I mean, if it was a K and then an I, then maybe they were trying to write the word kill, in which case we should be concerned. But VO, I had no idea what that might mean. Convinced that it was nothing more than kids being stupid little vandals, I told my wife that it was safe outside and she could come take a look at what the kids had been scratching. She seemed relieved to know that it was nothing too sinister and that we'd most probably remain undisturbed for the remainder of our stay. In fact, all we occupied our thought with for a minute or two was wondering if the owners would help themselves to our security deposit if they discovered the damage. After my wife had gotten some clothes on, we both headed outside to check the damage. I shined my flashlight at it, showing her the weird V and O shapes, and watched a very visible look of fright come over her face. I asked her what she thought it was, and she asked how I couldn't see it. To me, it was just weird shapes or letters, and to her, it was quite literally the devil. I'll be honest, I didn't really see it at first, and I thought it was just her nerves talking. But her fright proved infectious, and when she decided that she didn't want to stay another night at the cabin, I was in no position to make her stay. I remember her saying, "This has red flags all over it. We'd be morons not to leave now." And honestly, she was right. It didn't really matter who it was or why they'd been scratching something into the wall of our cabin. Our car was out front, and they could quite literally see the cabin was occupied. And who the hell goes snooping around the woods in the middle of the night like that anyway? No one with any good in mind, that's for sure. We packed our stuff, threw it all into our car, and then left as soon as we could. First, my wife called the cops to report what had happened, and then she left a message with the owner of the cabin explaining the situation. They were kind enough to refund our final night's stay and returned our security deposit in full, thus ruling out our bizarre conspiracy theory that the owners were trying to claim our security deposit. We still have no idea who or what was really going on that night, and honestly, I'm open to the idea that we just overreacted to some dumb prank or something. But having said that, I have no regrets about cutting our little vacation short because my wife is right. We've seen enough horror movies to know that you don't stick around once things get weird. One of my earliest memories is being in the playground at a new school, trying to make friends. This was year 3, so elementary school age for the Americans reading, and I came across a group of lads playing football. I asked one of them if I could join in, and he told me, "Yeah, but only if you just pass to me." It seemed like a fair deal, so I accepted. The next day I asked the same lad if I could sit with him at lunchtime, and he said, "Yeah, but only if I can have your pudding." Loftier fare that time, but I agreed nevertheless, and then we ate lunch in near silence. I didn't touch my pudding, assuming this lad was going to take it when he was good and ready, but when he'd finished his pudding, I offered him mine, and he suddenly had a change of heart. He shook his head, pushed the little bowl back in my direction, and we've been friends ever since. Walker, as I came to call him on account of it being his second name, was my best mate all throughout primary school, and we ended up in the same secondary school, too. I had my first pint with him. Our first girlfriends were best friends, and he was part of almost every significant event in my teenage years in some form or another. We were finally separated by going to different unis, and we kept in touch, and he ended up moving back here for work once he graduated. He was there for me all through my breakups. He helped me move into my first real flat, and I was the best man in his wedding, and the list goes on and on. I was there for all the ups and downs of him and Kathy buying a house, having a baby, all that other grown-up stuff, and I was the first person Walker called about the accident. So it was early April when he rang me up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. I knew something was going on because of how late the call came, but I never could have guessed of how terrible the news was. Kathy had been walking their daughter back from playgroup when 2 joyriders plowed into them at a zebra crossing, and their little girl was pronounced dead on the scene, while Kathy passed away in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. In just a few hours, Walker's whole world had been snatched away from him by 2 monsters in a BMW, and he was every bit as devastated as you can imagine. He was signed off sick from work, prescribed antidepressants, and then went to live with his parents because he just couldn't look after himself. We all pitched in looking after him, making sure that he stayed away from the drink and all that, but that was just about all we could do. Losing your wife and kid like that, just totally out of the blue. A person's gotta get through that on their own, you know? And for ages, Walker just seemed paralyzed, and I honestly couldn't blame him. But the one day, I get a very surprising text from him that just said, "Are you up for some rambling?" Just to explain, rambling was what we called the hiking/camping trips that we used to go on when we were younger. I think we always fancied ourselves soldiers, but since we'd never be able to pass the piss test, wink wink, we settled for these epic rambles across the countryside, sometimes for a week at a time. We'd camp out in different locations every night and then return home unshowered and stinking of campfire smoke. In between getting very unsober and telling ghost stories around the fire at night, it was bloody good fun. We managed about 5 or 6 big and small trips before jobs and girlfriends started eating up all our time. But as much as I looked forward to the day that we got to go again, I thought it might have been a bit too soon. After talking it over, we settled on the second week of April, almost 1 year after the accident. I tried telling myself the timing of it was nothing but a coincidence, but at the same time, I completely understood if he wanted to get away from it all for a few days, especially around the 1-year anniversary. And there was always something quite soothing about our rambles. If you're running out of food and water while exposed to the elements, there's no time to worry about problems you got back in the, air quotes, real world. I didn't know how far that would extend into devastating grief, but in the short term, it definitely seemed to work. With him having something to focus his mind on, Walker seemed much more chipper. He was ordering camping gear online, testing it out in his mom's back garden, and with all the planning that we had to do, he was much chattier too. It was just like the old times in many ways, but with one distinct difference, aside from the obvious stuff. Walker had suggested a place for us to visit. Anyone reading this might be like, yeah, so what? But he never made any of the decisions when it came to any of our rambling trips. After I took the lead in planning the first couple, and they all went as planned, he decided to leave that side of things to me so he could focus on gear and getting us there. So, when he told me he wanted to visit the Scottish Highlands, and in particular a place called Lochinver, it made for a refreshing change, if I'm being honest. We'd never been to the Highlands before, so I was very keen to go, as it was, but Walker's zigzagging route included a lot of freshwater lakes, some hill walking, and a big dirty fry-up at the end of it, which to me sounded absolutely banging. The longest we'd ever been rambling for was a week, and since we were only just starting back up again, it didn't really surprise me when he said that he only wanted to go for 2 days. I was just made up that he seemed to be getting back to himself again, but if I'd have known what he really had planned, I don't think I'd have ever gone with him. Everything seemed fine on the drive up to Lochinver. In fact, it was just like old times. We took turns driving and putting on old playlists and generally reveling in a bit of nostalgia to kill time on the drive. Parking was easy and cheap, and then add some unexpectedly good weather for April into the mix, and you had a great start to a properly epic hike. Considering it was his first time, Walker had done a stand-up job of planning our route, and it took us over some incredible-looking country. We must have walked around for 5 or 6 miles up and down a gently sloping hill and then along a narrow river until we came to a small loch. The way down was very steep, and the river dropped off into a waterfall which fed into the larger lake. It made for some banging scenery, and I knew immediately that it was going to be our first camping spot, and I'd have pat Walker on the back if I didn't think it'd send him toppling down the slope. We found a nice, flat, grassy spot about 50 meters away from the water's edge, and then set up our little A-frame shelters facing one another. Once we were set up, we brewed up some tea on our hexamine burners and then set about gathering up firewood for the night. We were quiet while we worked, and I put this down to us both concentrating on the job of finding decent kindling, but afterwards, Walker didn't seem to perk up again. I realized about halfway into cooking my dinner that he wasn't going to join me, but he said that he wasn't feeling hungry and would eat later on when the feeling came to him. But later came and went, and he still didn't seem to have anything to eat. We stayed up quite late, too, and all we did was sit by the fire, swapping stories. But I didn't see so much as a morsel pass his lips. When I turned into bed, Walker said that he'd only be staying up a little while longer to watch the stars. That didn't raise any alarm bells, but what did was when I woke up about 6 or 7 hours later and found him still sat by the fire. I'm not talking sat by the fire making a brew with bedhead, having obviously gotten at least a few hours kip. I'm talking same position, tent seemingly undisturbed, like he hadn't moved a muscle for hours on end. The first words out of my mouth when I scooched out of my shelter were, "Did you not get any sleep?" He didn't need to answer me. The big black bags under his eyes said everything, and it was around then that I started to realize that agreeing to the camping trip might not have been a good idea. I asked him if he was okay, and actually laughed a little when he told me, "A bit tired." I responded by asking him if he was really okay, before telling him that there was no shame in tapping out and going home if he really didn't feel up to it. In any other circumstances, if someone had given me some cryptic answer like, "I just had a lot on my mind," I'd have told them to bugger off and talk plain English. But in Walker's case, I knew what he was talking about, or rather, I assumed I knew. His reply shut me up for a minute, and when I finally thought of something else to say, I offered him some coffee to help perk him up a bit. He turned the offer down, saying his stomach was feeling a bit rough and would stick to water for the time being. I left him chill by the fire while I went to gather some more firewood, and while I was gone, I did some thinking. He turned down coffee, he turned down dinner the night before, and I didn't see any empty packaging or used mess tins when I woke up. This meant that Walker had either cleaned and stowed away all of his cooking gear and utensils, immaculately at that, or he hadn't eaten a single frigging thing in more than 24 hours. I stopped collecting firewood the second it occurred to me, and while I didn't go dropping what I'd already collected, I immediately walked back to camp. In the nicest way possible, without trying to sound like his mum or anything like that, I told him he needed to eat if he was going to have the strength to hike anywhere else. I felt for him, I really did, but he had to look after himself because being out in the highlands, miles from road, was not the time to start intermittent fasting. I kept on rabbiting for a bit, generally just pleading with him to talk to me, then, in frustration, I walked over to his rucksack, opened it up, and started rummaging around for his food supply. I rummaged and rummaged and rummaged some more before I realized that Walker didn't bring any food. It wasn't just some oopsie-daisy either. He'd done it deliberately. But why? The obvious thing that came to mind, and what just about scared the life out of me to think about, was the idea that he'd driven us out there so he could take his own life. To my infinite relief, he denied that was the case, but when he got all cryptic again, I told him that he could tell me what was going on, or I was leaving. It was a total bluff, but it worked, and that's when he told me, or partially told me, what he had planned. There was no hike, no tour around the locks for a few days before a big dirty fry-up in Lochinvar. He, and I use his words, needed to do something for Kathy and the baby, and that something involved not eating and not sleeping. He was okay to drink water, but only when he was really dying of thirst, and when he'd refrained from eating and sleeping for 3 days, he was going to go into the waterfall. Remember the waterfall I mentioned, the one that we had a view from our campsite? Well, Walker said that there was a shallow alcove in the rock behind it. It was nothing big, just enough room for a single person to sit without getting too wet, and when I asked him how he knew, he told me that he'd verified during the night. Everything was exactly how it said it would be, and when I asked what it was, Walker said that he was too tired to explain. The only reason he partially explained what he was doing was that he needed me there, and he believed that if he didn't tell me, then I might have actually left. He knew what it looked like, a guy starving himself because he's tired of living or something, but he assured me that it wasn't like that. He needed me there to help him get back to the car when he was done because chances were he'd be too weak to do it on his own. I remember sitting there by the fire for a minute or two, stunned into silence, just trying to wrap my head about what Walker was telling me. When I finally got my thoughts together, I asked him why he needed to sit in that little alcove after 3 days of no food or sleep. I'd help him, all right. I just needed to know why. Again, he just said something along the lines of, "It's for Kathy and the baby." And if I'm honest, that was as good as an explanation as I needed. I had next to no idea what he was trying to do, but I knew that it would be hard, and probably dangerous too. But what else can you do when a friend asks you to do something like that, telling you that they can't trust anyone else to do it? There was no dragging him out of there. Leaving him was just out of the question. And as much as it seemed like the best option, calling the emergency services felt like betrayal. Imagine someone inputting all that trust into you and you just turn around and have them locked up. I know that that's the emotional and not rational response, but in the moment, it just didn't feel right. There seemed like no other option but to do as he asked and make sure that whatever he was going to put himself through, he made it out the other side okay. As it turned out, the first day of his fast was actually the day before we drove up, the second being the hike out to the waterfall. Walker did seem a bit tired out in the hike, but I just put that down to age and a bad night's sleep or something. So, that second day we were in the highlands. That was going to be the third and final day of no eating or sleeping, meaning his whole plan was going to be over and done by the early hours of the morning. It sounded like good news when I heard it, but it was still proper worrying to see him in such a rough state. It was the lack of sleep that really wore him down. You could watch his brain just frazzling from being awake for so long, with sod all to fuel it. And when he went to the toilet, his pee looked brown. Not that unhealthy-looking dark yellow that you see after a summer's night in a beer garden. It was this sickly brown, like rum or whiskey or something. I know it might seem a bit odd fixating on his pee like that, but stuff like that's quite shocking when you've never seen it before. It wasn't just his body either. It was his mind. He started saying things twice, stumbling over words and then skipping back to an early part of a conversation, like he just lost his train of thought and 10 or 20 minutes hadn't gone by. And by the time the sun started to go down, I was ready for it to be over, but we had quite a way to go before that. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night either. I wasn't entirely convinced that Walker wasn't going to try and hurt himself in some way. I just had to trust that he wouldn't. I quizzed him more and more as the night went on, but he became less and less in the mood for chat. However, he did tell me that he had been thinking about that night for months and had gone over it in his head so many times that it bored him to think about, let alone talk about. He told me he understood how annoying that must be, but he would tell me all about it when it was over. But until then, I had to wait. When the time finally came, I walked him over to the waterfall and he began to take off his clothes. I suppose that was always a given. He didn't want to get his only jacket and pair of boots soaking wet in the process. But it was still bloody freezing out, and he was shaking like a dog as he passed me that last of his clothes. Over the sound of the waterfall, I heard him tell me that if he called out or wasn't back out within an hour, I was to go in and pull him out. He would be naked and soaking wet in the freezing Scottish night, and he would be in danger of getting hypothermia if he stayed exposed for too long. And that only added to all the anxiety as he thanked me one last time, turned, and disappeared into the water. Exactly 27 minutes had gone by when I first thought that I heard something over the sound of the waterfall. I remember straining my ears, thinking that they might have been playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. It was barely audible over the sound of the waterfall, but it sounded an awful lot like a person. And then suddenly, there was Walker. He was as white as a sheet, skinny as a rake, and shivering violently. Then there were the noises that he was making, and my God, they were inhuman. Not quite weeping, not quite screaming, all blunted by 3 days of no food or sleep. As soon as he reached the banks of the stream, he just collapsed, and I threw his jacket around him. He couldn't speak, he could barely move, and I did everything I could to drag him back to the fire and plonk him down next to it so he could properly warm up. I asked him if he could eat, and he nodded very weakly, so I threw a few cereal bars and a bottle of water in front of him. I had to actually feed him and bring the bottle to his lips to get him to eat properly. Walker ate slowly, with silent tears rolling down his cheeks, and I'd be a liar if I said that I didn't shed a few too. Once he had gotten a bit of food and water in him, Walker asked me to help him into his tent so he could finally sleep. I made sure that he was dry, helped him into a few underlayers, and then eased him into his sleeping bag. I think he was asleep before I had even finished tucking him in, and I wanted nothing more than to climb into my own sleeping bag for some well-deserved rest. But when it came to it, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was trapped between being too tired to stay awake and too scared to fall asleep. But then the harder I tried to fight it, the easier it came. I don't know exactly what time it was at that point, but I remember there being a little creeping blue in the distant horizon. I closed my eyes for a second, and then the next thing I knew, it was full daylight. My eyes burned, and I felt sick from how exhausted I was. But when I saw that Walker was still there, asleep and breathing, I knew everything was going to be fine. I tried to catch a few more hours, but an overactive brain fueled by a disco nap made that a no-go. I wanted to wake him up, make him eat a little bit more, and get some coffee down him, but it was for selfish reasons. What I really wanted to know was what happened in the waterfall, what he'd put himself through hell for. But God knows he needed the rest, and there would be plenty of time for questions on the way back. I suppose this piece is long enough as it stands, so I'll try to summarize that conversation as best I can. After getting Walker back into Lochinver safely, we had a little bit more food, bought Walker one of those big bottles of Lucozade so he could carry on replenishing on the drive, and then started on our journey back home. He didn't tell me much about what he'd done or why he'd done it. He said that he was still taking it all in himself, but the long and short of it was this. He'd read something online about that waterfall, something about how old monks used to go there to have religious experiences. The story went that if you concentrated on praying for someone hard enough, someone who had already passed on, you could either hear them, see them, talk to them, or something to that effect. The only rule was that you had to sit there for 3 days with nothing but the water in front of you to drink. Obviously, Walker had tried to streamline the process for safety and convenience, thinking that as long as he drank a little of the water, he could do all the fasting and staying awake away from the waterfall itself. He'd been quite worried that it had ruined the process and therefore ruined the desired effect, but it didn't. According to Walker, the process had worked exactly as intended. I feel like I have to explain at this point I'm not a religious person and I don't believe in ghosts, spirits, or any of that oogly-boogly nonsense. I think Walker pushed himself to his physical and psychological limits and induced a kind of visual or auditory hallucination, and I think deep down he knows that too. The thing is, he doesn't care, and I don't really blame him either. And as much as I'm not going to pretend to know how it worked, I understand why he wanted to do it. To have that opportunity to see or talk to a missed relative, even if it isn't real, I admit to seeing the appeal. Whatever happened, Walker started doing much better after the trip. Everyone put it down to finally getting back to the great outdoors and reliving a bit of his youth. We never told anyone what had actually happened. Walker didn't swear me to secrecy or anything like that, but he didn't have to. Because whatever happened in that little alcove behind the waterfall, that's between him and his dearly departed. I'm a 31-year-old female, originally from Oregon, and I was 28 when the story took place. Back during the whole #MeToo thing, I remember talking to a friend of mine about the whole not all men thing. We both agreed that it's a ridiculous state to label all men as predators, but we disagreed on something a little more nuanced. My friend believed that since just about anyone, no matter how nice they looked or how pleasant they acted, could be a predator, it made sense to exercise a degree of caution around every man outside of immediate family. I thought it was quite a pessimistic way of looking at things, and that it made sense to employ the caution of a case-by-case basis. I'm not going to plug the first 2 digits of 911 into my phone if an Uber driver asks me how my day's been, but follow me down a dark side street and I'm reaching for my pepper spray. We went back and forth like that for a while over a few glasses of alcohol, and as much as there are always friendly exchanges, we never got to any solid conclusions. However, my friend said something that really stuck with me. It's not all men, but one is enough. I had no idea how right she truly was. You see, a few months later, I drove out to government camp in my native Oregon, parked my car in the old Golden Poles parking lot, and then headed up for my favorite trail into the foothills of Mount Hood. I went for 2 reasons. Number 1, I was itching to get outdoors again after 6 months of being locked inside, and number 2, I was working on a photography project as part of my lockdown side hustle, and getting the right pictures of the mountain and its surroundings were a huge part of it. Anyway, I walk up to just about where the ski runs start, took my pictures, then started making my way back down towards town, snapping shots along the way. About halfway down, I reach a fork in the trail on my left, and when I looked, I saw someone standing there on the trail. They immediately stood out because they weren't wearing hiking gear, and I'd never seen anyone so far up the trail who wasn't wearing ski or hiking attire. He had long hair, sneakers, baggy shorts, and a t-shirt, just your average white skater guy, maybe 20 to 24 years old. I guess that's not entirely out of the ordinary on its own, but this guy had no backpack, no water bottle, he just looked lost. We made eye contact for a second, and I gave him a polite smile before heading off on my way. But as I did, I heard him call after me with something like, "Does this trail head up the mountain?" I told him no, but it'd lead him to a trail that would take him up the mountain, and then I wished him luck and carried on walking. I don't think I even got 4 or 5 steps away before I heard him call out again, only that time, he said something so strange it actually made me do one of those silent little laughs. The guy says, and in a way that made it sound like there had been some minor confusion, "Hey, I think that's my bag." I stopped, smiled at how crazy of a statement it was, and then turned back and told him with just a hint of laughter that he must be confused. He started walking towards me, slowly and casually, saying, "Nah, that's totally my bag. I've been looking for it all afternoon." Giving him the benefit of the doubt, I just slipped my backpack off my shoulders and then showed him, like, "I can promise you, it's mine. It even has my name on it, see?" And I showed him the tag, saying Maddie. He leaned in and squinted, like the writing was tiny and not in big block capital letters, then asked me in a voice that sounded genuinely hurt, "Why would you do that?" I remember literally hearing that "F this, I'm out" jingle in my head, and this guy was either playing a stupid prank on me, with his buddy recording from behind a tree, or he was actually crazy, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out which one. I turned my politeness up to 100, smiled and told him, "I'm so sorry, I gotta go. I hope you find your bag, okay?" He stayed quiet as I turned and began to walk away, and I found myself hoping that that'd be the end of the exchange. But as I found out, that was more wishful thinking than accurate assessment. As the sound of his footsteps followed me down the trail, I started to get nervous. This wasn't some unusual encounter with a weirdo stranger anymore. The weirdo stranger was now following me down a quiet hillside trail with not another soul in sight. Remember what I said about pepper spray in side streets? Well, that rule applies to mountain trails too, and I always keep one of those cute little miniature pepper sprays on my car keys. In one smooth motion, I slipped my backpack off my shoulder again, shoved a hand into the little pocket where I kept my car keys, and then shoved them into my pocket for easier access. And once that was in place, I felt a little more comfortable getting vocal again. I asked the guy if he was following me. He told me yes, because I had his backpack. I told him that's not a funny joke, and it wasn't funny the first time, and he told me it wasn't a joke. He wanted his backpack returned, and if I didn't give it to him, he was going to have to take it. As we're still walking, me with my back to him, and him about 15 feet behind me, I told the guy that it was starting to sound like he was threatening me. When he heard that, he took on this sort of indignant tone, asking me how dare I try and play the victim when it was me that had stolen his backpack. I was so convinced that it was a prank by that period that I actually stopped, turned around and started looking for the similarly dumb-looking skater guy with some smartphone, and looking back on it, I think that was just wishful thinking. If there was someone else there, I wasn't dealing with another crazy person, but when I realized that we were truly alone on the trail, that was not a nice feeling, I can tell you that. So once it hit me that this guy is either crazy or trying to rob me in the weirdest way imaginable, I reach for my pepper spray. I take it out, I show him, and he pulls that frustrated card again. I tell him if he doesn't stop following me, I'm gonna pepper spray him, and then I'm calling the cops. He responds by saying stuff like, "Do it, call the cops. That's my bag you're carrying, with my stuff in it." Once again, I told him if he came within 5 feet of me, I was gonna pepper spray him, and then I turned back and immediately realized the problem that I was facing. If I wanted to really be safe, I'd have to walk freaking backwards the whole rest of the way down to government camp. The best I could do was keep a minimum safe distance and just keep my hand on my pepper spray. This guy trailed me for a great distance for a while, yelling after me as we walked down, and the more he talked, the more obnoxious he got. Like I might have mentioned at the start that he was acting polite and well-mannered, then he switched to the victim tone that he'd adopted. But as time went on, he got more and more obnoxious. I remember at one point he said something like, "I just don't understand why you're being such a bee about it. Just admit that you're wrong already and hand over my stuff." And then as he got more aggressive, it became things like, "You need therapy. You could do hours of sessions and not work out all the crap you got going on in your head." He actually said that. My blood was boiling, but I knew better than to react. If anything, he just wanted to stop me so he could close the distance again, or failing that, he just wanted this weird attention that I chose not to give him. Aside from the occasional look over my shoulder to make sure that he wasn't trying to close in on me, I tried not to give the guy so much as a word. The distance from where I ran into the guy and where the trail ended was maybe only a mile, so after a few minutes walking, I could literally see people walking around near the houses at the end of East Blossom Trail. and just seeing them was a huge relief. I felt like I was almost back on a friendly territory, you know? That even if the guy was being a jerk, he wouldn't dare put his hands on me if there were other people around. But even better, I suddenly see these two hikers walking up the trail towards us. I figured rather than risk this guy following me back to my car, I'd ask these hikers to accompany me, but as we got closer, the guy following me tried one last trick. The second I called out to the two hikers, he started screaming over me. He was saying stuff like, "Help me, my sister is off her meds and she wants to take her own life. You gotta help me, grab her." I remember looking back at him, completely boiling over at that point, wondering if I'd accidentally ran into the biggest moron or psychopath on the face of the planet. And then as I turned back to call out something to oppose what he said, I heard these fast, heavy footsteps coming up at me. I remember turning, seeing the guy sprinting at me, and letting off a burst of pepper spray at the last second before he collided with me. Thank Christ, most, if not all, of the spray was effective, despite his efforts to shield his face as he ran at me. So as I found my feet, I was shaken, but I was still furious, and it was deeply satisfying to see him rubbing his eyes, screaming in pain. The hikers had ran up onto the scene by the time I was up again, and I explained everything very clearly, that the creep was not my brother, and that he'd been harassing me all the way down the trail. They very kindly told me that they'd keep him there for as long as it took to lose sight of me, and as I walked off, I pulled out my phone and I called the cops. I was almost at the end of the trail when I heard this scream. You can't tell me crap. Just from a way distance away, and then right as I looked back, the two hikers were wrestling this guy to the ground. I just kept walking as I relayed all of this information to 911, feeling incredibly thankful that those two hikers showed up when they did. Even when I thought it was safe, I know now looking back on it that I wasn't. People have been snatched in broad daylight before, and there's no telling what would have happened if he continued to follow me. What I find incredibly creepy to this day is just how devious he tried to be, and how he seemed to enjoy trying to mentally overpower me as opposed to physically overpowering me. Although I do get the feeling that the mental thing was just an appetizer for something that he never got a chance to do. I couldn't tell if he was truly psychotic or just mentally ill. Born on December 19th of 1986, Christina Kaleka grew up in Canada as the only daughter of divorced Filipino migrants Elizabeth and Mario Kaleka. Like many Filipinos, she had a devoutly Catholic upbringing and was also described as hard-working and a natural leader, with ambitions of attending teachers' college at Toronto's York University. At 5'2" and 125 pounds, she kept in shape by playing volleyball and would only occasionally try jogging. Just before the civic holiday of 2007, Christina had planned to take part in a Christian youth conference in the city of Montreal. But at the last minute, she pulled out in favor of a hiking trip to Ontario's Rainbow Falls Provincial Park, accompanied by her 20-year-old cousin, Faith Costello, and two friends, Eddie Miga and Joe Benedict. Rainbow Falls Provincial Park covers an area of about 2 square miles and is located on Highway 17 between the towns of Schreiber and Rossport. There are 2 main camping areas within its boundaries: the primary White Sand Lake site, which is just a few hundred meters from the park's entrance, and the smaller Rossport site, which is 3 kilometers to the west, not far from the Trans-Canada Highway. The vast majority of the hiking trails in the park are relatively easy, averaging between 3 and 5 kilometers. The only exception is the Cask Isles Trail, which is a whopping 32 miles long and runs through the park from Rossport all the way to Terrace Bay. But step off the trails into Rainbow Falls and you'll run into what some have described as the most rugged terrain in the province. Just after 12 p.m. on Sunday, August 5th of 2007, Christina and friends arrived at the park. Christina had been at the wheel for the 14-hour drive from Toronto, and after completing what had turned into a 2-day journey, the group were exhausted. They set up camp on Lot 88 of the White Sand Lake campsite, then exchanged a few friendly greetings with their new but temporary neighbors. White Sand Lake was very busy that weekend, with only a handful of lots left unoccupied. Yet as the hustle and bustle of the holiday weekend went on outside, Christina and her friends settled down for a nap. The group were exhausted from their 2-day drive, so what was intended to be a half-hour nap turned into more like a 4-hour snooze. They awoke around 10:30 at night, made a small campfire, and then ate dinner together while consuming a small amount of alcohol. Around 3:30 a.m., the group decided to head back to bed, and all are thought to have been asleep within 30 minutes. 3 hours later, Christina woke up Eddie and asked him to accompany her to the campsite's communal showers. According to Eddie, the pair had planned to go running together at dawn, and after washing and dressing themselves, they headed out into the trails. The pair ran together for a period of around 30 minutes, then, at some point, Christina began to tire. Then, upon reaching an intersection near the park entrance, the pair decided to split up. Eddie would continue along the longer of the two trails towards Highway 17, while Christina opted to visit the nearby eponymous Rainbow Falls waterfall before returning to camp. Eddie only made so far as a small, roadside picnic area before he too began to tire. He briefly stopped to catch his breath, carved the first initials of all 4 members into a rock, and then made his way back to camp. He claimed to have spent the next few hours searching for an axe to whittle down some oversized logs, but was unable to find one. At around 9:30 a.m., Joe Benedict and Faith Costello emerged from their tents. They made breakfast and took showers, believing Christina would return at any moment, but by 11 a.m., they began to grow concerned. Joe and Eddie went down one of the trails to the waterfall Christina had wanted to visit. They also searched the Lake Superior Trail and Rainbow Falls Trail, as well as a number of other trails they suspected her to have jogged down, but she was nowhere to be found. The 2 men remained calm and refrained from raising the alarm, believing that Christina would soon be found. However, by mid-afternoon, she had yet to reappear. Around 2 p.m., the group approached a park ranger to report Christina missing. Park rangers then joined the group of friends in continuing their search of nearby trails and beaches. When it became evident that she was missing, they advised them to report her disappearance to the police. The Ontario Police's Regional Emergency Response Team took charge of the search and quickly established a command post near White Sand Island. Almost 100 personnel then scoured the area, including police officers, firefighters, and specifically trained divers who searched nearby lakes and streams. They utilized GPS equipment, underwater radar, infrared cameras, and 4 canine units, along with 2 fixed-wing airplanes, a float plane, 3 helicopters, and a plethora of watercraft, but no trace of Christina could be found. Poor weather and rough terrain made the search extremely difficult, and some search personnel were severely injured in the course of their work. One man needed emergency surgery when a rappelling accident resulted in horrific facial lacerations, while another was taken to the hospital with a sprained ankle and twisted knee following a nasty fall down a steep slope. An unusual aspect of the search involved the use of tracker dogs, who were walking up and down the Rainbow Falls and Cask Isles trails in search of Christina's scent. Although they picked up her trail in places that she had been running with Eddie Miga, there was no traces of her anywhere else, including up near Rainbow Falls. She was gone all right, but her scent trail suggested that she had left the park. At this point, the search for Christina became highly scientific. The search teams began studying maps of the area in order to identify so-called anthropogenic corridors. This is a fancy term for what we might refer to as natural pathways that occur off the beaten path, such as streams or rivers, even electrical lines. Anything a person might believe will lead them back to civilization. The search team also based their Phase 2 search areas as a highly advanced lost hiker behavioral profile. This stated that there was a 90% chance that she was still within a 5-mile radius of her last known position, but her condition remained another question entirely. The strategy led to some interesting developments in the search. A pair of socks were recovered from a deep pool of water in the Hewitson River, a tributary that feeds into the larger White Sands Lake. Search teams also found several footprints in a mossy area of the ground not far from the waterfall. While the footprints matched Calica's shoe size, the lack of preserved tread pattern made it impossible to determine if they were created by one of her running shoes. Against the advice of provincial police, Christina's family traveled out to Rainbow Falls. There, they set up a series of tents on lots rented by friends and well-wishers and refused to leave until Christina was found. They were joined by Raul Escarpe, a Catholic priest and fellow Filipino-Canadian who performed special masses for the family to allay their fears. Escarpe also helped raise the case's public profile, and within just a few days, a team of around 200 volunteers was scouring the surrounding area. The team included politicians from nearby Schreiber and Terrace Bay, but also some very experienced search and rescue personnel who weren't just using the opportunity as a photo op. August 11th saw a search that lasted a full 8 hours, covering the area between the provincial parks East Beach and Highway 17. The following day signaled another long search, but this time, less than 100 of the original volunteers showed up to try again. Frustrated with the lack of results, Christina's family openly admitted that their hope was fading. High-ranking Ontario police officers assured them that the chances of her survival were high, but her loved ones were quite clearly prepared for the worst. They've used canine units, they've used planes, they've used submarines, Christina's uncle despaired. They've used all sorts of different ways to find Christina, and nothing, absolutely nothing works. There's no clue at all. By August 21st, the police began using a chilling euphemism to refer to Christina as a non-responsive person, meaning that she would not have been able to reply if she heard searchers calling her name. The move prompted law enforcement to reallocate all aircraft and canine units away from the search, leaving only a skeleton crew of 20 officers to continue the effort. And then finally, 2 days later, the search was called off, and it was announced that investigative theories now surrounded the possibility of abduction. However, the Kalikoff family once again openly criticized the investigation, claiming the abduction theory wasn't based on any concrete evidence. It was widely accepted that, alive or dead, she was clearly no longer in the park. But if that was the case, where did she go? Some maintain that Christina vanished as a result of a bear attack, and that any potential remains were carried off and consumed by the animal. Yet if this was the case, there would most certainly be plenty of evidence in the form of ripped clothing, blood, or drag marks. Stephen Herrero of the University of Calgary, who once authored a weighty tome on the nature and circumstances of bear attacks, was quoted as saying it was not impossible, but highly unlikely that Christina had fallen victim to a bear, and that predators of that kind rarely travel more than 600 feet before consuming a kill. Another distinct possibility that Christina died as a result of what might legally be referred to as misadventure. Many have cited Christina's lack of experience when it came to wilderness hiking, and believe that it likely led to her becoming lost and disoriented, especially if she was already exhausted following their long 2-day journey. But again, if this had been the case, some trace of her would have been recovered, even if it was the tragic discovery of her lifeless body. Prior to Christina, the only other person missing in the park was recovered safely in less than 9 hours, and 95% of all missing person cases are solved within the first 24 hours. With this in mind, we start to understand the frustrations experienced by law enforcement and why more and more of those involved began to suspect foul play. As recently as 2018, Catherine's mother had expressed her belief that her daughter was either abducted or murdered. Citing the proximity of the nearby Trans-Canada Highway, Elizabeth believed her overly trusting daughter might have provided the perfect target to a potential killer who would then be able to almost instantly abscond. Despite accusations that Christina's 3 friends had something to do with her disappearance, they have vehemently denied any involvement and are not considered suspects. Don MacArthur, a former mayor of Schreiber, has stated that he doesn't believe any local resident is guilty of her abduction or murder. According to him, the only other known homicide in the area occurred back in 2005 and was mostly related to the local drug trade. Perhaps one of the most probable theories was posted by the host of CBC's The Next Call podcast with David Ridgen. He suggested that convicted child predator Dennis Leveille might have been involved in Christina's disappearance, given his history of abusing teenage girls. What's more, her disappearance fits into the window of time in which Leveille was actively preying. Ridgen has theorized that following her run, Christina took off her socks to wade into the waters of the Hewitson River, and it was there that she was ambushed by her killer. He dismissed the notion that the socks recovered from the river could not have belonged to Christina, saying that they only appeared larger due to being submerged for so long. Ridgeon's theories, though seemingly well thought out, have been roundly dismissed by the Ontario Provincial Police, who don't believe Christina was deliberately or maliciously killed. In fact, one or two detectives even floated the idea that Christina intentionally disappeared to sever ties with her community and family. It certainly wouldn't be the first time that a member of a strict religious community had a sudden change of heart, and rather than face the ire and shame of their loved ones, they disappeared themselves instead. However, there is a strong evidence to suggest that Christina had a wonderful relationship with her parents and continued to share their deep Christian faith. She was unwavering in her attendance of certain Christian youth organizations, and even after pulling out of her most recent conference, she opted for a weekend camping with friends that she met at one of those very same conferences. Granted, the possibility can't be entirely ruled out, as people have hidden worse secrets from their families before. But in this case, whatever happened to Christina certainly didn't happen of her own volition. Other search and rescue personnel have questioned the effectiveness of the entire search effort. One volunteer claimed that entire sections of the forest were so dense that if a person were to become immobilized, the mass of surrounding vegetation would be enough to keep their body upright. This would potentially obscure the body from any other aerial search teams, which by far covered the most ground during the search. Ontario Police Officer Greg Beasley also spoke of such difficulties, telling one journalist that when you trip, you don't fall down. Perhaps the closest any investigation has come to uncovering the truth behind Christina's disappearance was back in March of 2009. Jeff Hasse, a volunteer with the Minnesota Search and Rescue nonprofit, stated that he believed volunteers actually located Christina's remains in November of 2009. During this privately funded search, 6 cadaver dogs indicated the presence of human remains at a location in the Hewitson River, but further investigation was made impossible by the speed and depth of the water. Hasse believes that if the private search and rescue teams had access to more advanced equipment, their task might have been concluded there and then. Perhaps that is indeed the case, and Christina Kaleka's remains lie deep under the waters of Rainbow Falls. But just as many other leads in the case have proven to be dead ends, perhaps the reason she's never been found in the park is that she's no longer there. As one police officer noted, the absence of remains is perhaps the best possible indicator that Christina was abducted, which begs the question, has the predator who took her met with some other kind of indirect justice, or do they still walk among us?